Oi, oi, it's your boy, Slacky J, coming at you on Wednesday, the 20th, because I've been deciding what to do after the fights at the weekend turned out to be an abortion. Uh, what did we have? We had three different events. It's just that all of them sort of failed to deliver. Actually, I'll give Rizin some credit there. They were all right. There was a couple of good fights on Rizin. There were a couple of good fights here and there on the UFC and Bellator cards. It's just that well, Bellator has this awful situation where they do have the most good fighters who aren't in the UFC of any of the other organizations. It's just that, as someone pointed out on Reddit the other day, as soon as there are stakes attached to a match, something stupid happens. Whereas the UFC event was well, not a lot of great fights on there, not a lot of great matchups, and then Bilal Muhammad main event, and he did. We're going to get into Bilal Muhammad today. I used to have a very positive outlook on him. I sort of got bored of his fights. I've been pissing people off on Twitter all week about him, but we're going to talk honestly about his style, and I'll probably call this pod, like, is boringness a real criticism? But yeah, people did not come away from that super hype. So if you missed it and you're waiting for me to tell you which ones to watch, find yourself a download of Rizin, which is fairly hard to do, but because there's a couple of good ones on there. The Roberto de Souza, who is Satoshi, his fight was... isn't he the Bitcoin guy? Have I just solved it? No, his fight was good. He's always good. And the women's atomweight fight between not Kana Asakura, the other lass who has been trading the title with her, Ayaka Hamasaki and Seika Izawa, and we're going to talk extensively about that today because it really played into my grappling nerd shit and also my up kick shit that I'm always on, and knees to the head on the ground shit. Actually, let's do that first. I mean, there was also some bollocks on the card, like Tsuyoshi Kosaka, who's now 53. Tsuyoshi Kosaka was notable for a long time for having the only win over Fedor in his prime, which was by cut. He missed a punch and his elbow cut Fedor open in an association where elbows weren't a legal strike, but it was part of a one-night tournament and they had to continue on to the next round. So they just quickly banged together. What happens here? Oh, TK wins by no contest cut. I don't think it was no contest. I think they gave him a cut stoppage or something like that, even though there was no precedent for elbows being allowed. And then they did a rematch, like they always do. It was like Dennis Horman beat Matt Hughes twice. It was like when Frank Shamrock got John Lober once he was the UFC champion. Just, you're well beyond this guy now, but we're doing the grudge match thing. And Fedor just battered TK the second time. If you want to go, that fight is basically an execution. It's awful. But the thing about TK is that he was an early MMA guy, and his best days were in the 1998 Lumax Cup, which was a random gi MMA competition in Japan. He had a couple of good fights in the UFC, but mainly he's notable for helping Frank Shamrock and Maurice Smith learn how to play the guard. And even at his best, he was losing every second fight. So now he's 53 and you're like, why is he here? Because he was 50 when he fought Krokop a little while ago, which was disgusting. And I know Krokop's old, but Krokop is also, he was on the sauce at the time. And he just won the K1 Bad Year Grand Prix. But anyway, TK fights this 0-0 karate guy, Mikio Ueda. That's the last time you'll hear that name. And actually hits him with a cross counter across the top and knocks him down and scored the ground and pound stoppage. It was kind of heartwarming, but it was also kind of like, why is this a main card fight? Who would pay for this? So that's your Rizin freaky bullshit. Their co-main event was a title fight for their featherweight belt between a guy Juntaro Ishiku, and Yutaka Saito, who had already lost his last two fights at featherweight and was in a featherweight title fight. Bizarre. But this is the theme with Rizin, and we're going to get into it. But the theme with Rizin is that they cannot keep good fighters because there's a lot of money requirements. You need to be able to give a fighter a number of fights a year, and sometimes they can't offer that. And, also these fighters, unless they're making PFL-style $1 million paydays for winning a tournament, they're not really going to be happy not fighting very good opponents for okay money, when they could be risking it all to fight great opponents for all the money in their heads. 12 and 12 more likely. But so what's happened numerous times now is that Rizin has brought up an interesting character. They've done well, they've won the belt, and they've left. So the most obvious examples are Jiri, who is now is he next in line for the UFC light heavyweight title shot? I think he is. Yeah, he's got a shot coming. And Manel Cup, or Cape, however we're saying that. And it's always a bad sign when you can't convince your champions to stay with money. But by the end, they had Jiri fighting Fabio Maldonado. And you're going, well, no, I can't see how talented this lad is if you've got him fighting Fabio Maldonado and then CB Dollaway once he dropped out of the UFC. And I think, didn't Dollaway fight a lot of his later career at middleweight? But yeah, that's the problem they have. They're going to have that with Satoshi, I imagine, at some point, because he's pretty much the best fighter on their roster, with always the exception of Koji Horiguchi, which is another great example. The best fighter in Japan. The best fighter Japan's ever produced. Now you can get into an argument about greatest, because Sakuraba obviously has all the big wins. Shinya Aoki beat a who's who of lightweights when they were ranked top 10. But in terms of skill, Koji Horiguchi probably the best fighter that Japan has ever produced. But it got to the point where they didn't even want him smashing their other lads anymore. They were going we're paying you too much to beat up our other talents. So now they're renting him out to Bellator. He's still a Rizin fighter, but all his fights now are in Bellator. But with all of that said, one of the interesting upsides of this is that nobody else in the world is paying for atomweights, with the exception of maybe one, but they're sort of they don't want good fighters. They just want Angela Lee to keep winning forever. Though they did lure Seohee Ham away, and Seohee Ham also fought in Rizin in their atomweight division, or super atomweight, whatever they're calling it. But it means that their women's atomweight division, or super atomweight division, whatever they're calling it, is actually really fun and good. They had Kanara Sakura and Ayaka Hamasaki going back and forth for a while, but this new lass on the scene, Seika Izawa, or Izawa Seika, I don't know which way around it is on Tapology. Yeah, she's come in, she was 5-0, oh, she was 4-0, only having fought in deep duels, and she beat the champion by triangle armbar, and she got the triangle from the bottom, turned her over, and was mounted in the triangle, hitting her with elbows for about 2 minutes before they stopped the fight. It was brutal. But this was the rematch to prove that it was a fluke on Hamasaki's end and that it wasn't on Izawa's end, and it was terrific fun. Izawa, this is the one to watch from the weekend, because Izawa, really great takedowns from a judo background, but also loses top position a lot, so she'll hit a beautiful takedown and then just end up on the bottom. But her grappling is so fun. Really makes use of the up kick, which we love. When she's on the bottom, puts her knees in front of the opponent's chest, frees one leg, kicks him in the face. And then she was doing terrific work on top, generally. Anytime Hamasaki turned into her to start building up on a takedown or something like that, because Hamasaki obviously more wrestling based, more what they called AACC. The team down there, there's a team of catch wrestling guys, and she's on it. It was Mega Megu's team, I believe, but she kept turning in to try and get in on a single leg or come up on a double or whatever. And Izawa would grab double underhooks in the way that, if you're pro wrestling savvy, the pedigree. I mean, if you grew up with pro wrestling, the pedigree, it was the move, where you get your biceps, basically, the crook of your elbows, underneath your opponent's elbows and pull them up behind their back as they're sort of face down driving into you. Or a double underhook suplex in pro wrestling. That's what's normally done from there. And it's a traditional catch wrestling move. You can roll, if you roll all the way through so that you're almost sitting back to back with them, the back of their neck's in your armpit and you can neck crank them. Doesn't often work, obviously, but it is a very interesting position, the stockade, and that's called a full stockade or a double stockade. And then the half stockade is the stuff that we talk about with Linton Vassell, and even guys like Craig Jones and Gordon Ryan are doing nowadays, where you snake your arm around the back of their head and put it in their far armpit, so that your one arm is bending their neck over like a full Nelson. But she kept getting these double underhooks, this pedigree position, And then she'd start kneeing the head from there. Because obviously if you've got the opponent's elbows behind their back, they can't put anything substantial in front of the knee. Even if their forearms are really long, they put their hands in front. It's just hands. It's not a good frame. So she's landing knees to the head from that position. And then she used it to dump the lass down on her side and started putting her knee over one of the arms. So that because your arm... Really interesting positions like that and the crucifix. If you can trap the arms with a leg, or one of the arms with a leg, and your hand is already around their head, you are a very short distance from snapping up a guillotine. So Gary Tonin does it a lot from the back crucifix. But she was trying to do it here from the stockade. She's putting her knee over the top of one of the lass's hands and wrapping the head. But it's interesting because, like, even in the course of looking like the better fighter and the stronger fighter and the more skilled fighter, she still gave up top position loads by accident. She still ended up deep in an armbar and was putting her foot on Hamasaki's face. She wasn't kicking her in the head. She was putting her foot on Hamasaki's face and pushing Hamasaki back into the armbar. It was really weird to watch. I put up a clip of it on Twitter just saying, this is UFC legal, you just won't see it because it makes no sense. But... yeah, 10 out of 10. Watch that fight. There was some other really cool stuff she did off the stockade, which I'm going to try. I'll try and remember, and I'll put up like a little article for the boys. But I was very impressed by her. And then in the main event, Roberto Satoshi, he looked a lot more wild than he did last time I saw him. Against Tafik Masayev, he looked great. He just came in low on the single, came up, climbed on his back, got the finish. This one, he was trying to strike, and his striking has always looked game, but also surprisingly good. In this one, he's just sort of swinging wild. But he ended up moving to the back body lock, and then trying to jump on the back, and Johnny Case tried to tripod him over the top, and one of his arms got stuck underneath Satoshi's leg, and Satoshi, quick as you like, recognised it and went into a back triangle and finished the armbar from there. He's a really fun fighter, 155 pounds, so he'd be in the thick of it in the UFC, or even in Bellator, actually. But you'd love to see it. So let's get into the real events this weekend. Bellator was the one that I tried to hype everyone up for. I was being white hat Jack this weekend. I was being good. I put out a Filthy Casuals guide to Patricio Pitbull, even though I can do a video about anything and it'll get a certain number of views. When I do a video about Bellator, it somehow gets less views than when I do one about, like, Sifu or some bollocks. So... really was doing them a solid this weekend, and so many people hit me up being like, I didn't know this fight was happening. I am interested in this fight. I have been hyping AJ McKee or Pitbull, and I had no idea this was happening. So classic Bellator in that sense. I don't know how they failed to let people know. But I was so hyped for this rematch, and then it sort of it fizzled. It was just dull. AJ McKee overwhelmed him in the first fight. I thought he did a really good job with when southpaw through body kicks and head kicks, which is... Emmanuel Sanchez had tried to do step-up left high kicks against Pitbull, which in their first fight he actually managed to rattle Pitbull a bit, because you're not going to be able to duck in, you're not going to be able to circle into that kick, and if you're just going to have to keep taking it on the arm. It's going to keep your arm at home when Pitbull's answer to everything is to step in and throw the right hand as soon as the opponent's stepping in. And if you're worried about getting kicked in the head, you can't really throw your right hand freely. But then the second time they fought, Pitbull had the read on him. He'd move away from it each time he tried the step-up kick, and then he'd step in and counter him, and eventually knocked him down and got the guillotine off it. But it was the step-up that was really keying him in on it, whereas McKee fighting southpaw, he was kicking straight out of the stance, and there wasn't that preliminary motion that is so easy to read if you're going to abuse that kick. But on the opposite end of that, in this fight, Patricio was using step-up inside low kicks to chew up McKee's leg. And I was going, oh, you know who likes those? That guy, Alexander Volkanovski, who you're both supposed to smash if you meet him. No, I mean, the takeaway from this fight for most people was like, these guys have nothing for Volkanovski. And I don't believe that's true. It's not really that simple. But Volkanovski's striking is operating on a much slicker level than AJ McKee's, and the volume and the feints would really give Pitbull trouble, I imagine, because Pitbull is sort of in the Machida mold, but with different specific techniques, but he has fewer exchanges, controls when the exchanges happen, and then times the intercepting counter, which was a very popular, well, it wasn't very popular, but it was a very successful style at the highest levels. For a little while, it was sort of what Anderson Silva did, Lyoto Machida did it, and then nowadays certainly in recent years, we've been drifting more to like an activity-heavy route to success. I think it was Dan Martin did a really good article about it called like Taking the Initiative or something like that for the Fight site. But it was looking like the way to win fights was becoming more and more to be the guy doing something all the time. And that sort of Machida, Anderson, I'm going to take this round off style fell by the wayside. Except Pitbull's still having great success with it. But really this one was marked by sort of a lower rate of activity than their previous fight. Well, their previous fight, AJ McKee came out of the gate and started kicking him. This one, AJ McKee's throwing awkward long 1-2s. Basically, the longer he stood, the more you realise that like his stand-up... Well, I'd noticed this against Pat Curran, but his stand-up relies a lot on just goofiness. He really loves the side kick, but he leaps up into it from a mile away so you can see it coming. His boxing is limited to 1-2s and he's leaning out as he throws them. And the only really meaningful exchange was, I think, in the third round. He threw his left straight from southpaw. Patricio timed the right hand across the top, the cross counter, the one that he's always looking for, wobbled him, ran after him, got taken down off it. And then all of McKee's groundwork was just trying to hold on, and Pitbull was doing a decent job getting up. But again, it's like, it's going to get into the argument of what we score. I saw someone on Reddit talking about like the scoring criteria and saying, no one even questions that Ngannou won despite not really doing much from the top, even though the rules are supposed to have changed to prohibit that. And of course, it was a very hot discussion with the Bilal Muhammad fight this weekend, which is not, I don't think anyone was arguing that he lost that fight or should have lost that fight, but the rules were supposed to have changed to like mitigate the effects of lay and pray. But yeah, I mean, people were arguing about the scorecards on this one. Big John was having a stroke on air. He was like, I believe AJ McKee has won every single round. But I honestly didn't care enough to even try scoring the rounds. I was watching it, and if I am going to get into like the scoring debate, which I don't like to, I normally want to do that on a second watching. I just want to sort of take in the fight the first time round, and I was not going to watch this again. But it does suck, because they're both good fighters, and they're both capable of a much more exciting fight than this. But the stakes and if AJ McKee was supposed to be running down his Bellator contract to then renegotiate for much, much higher money or go to the UFC, keep the leverage for it. And if he lost this one, that would hurt that a lot. And in the event, he did so little that he really hurt his own brand anyway. But Pitbull, if you're already down one to this guy and it was a complete blowout, if you lose the second one even by decision, there's no question of you getting a third, because they're not. I mean, unless they do another big tournament, and it'll take him a couple of years to do that, and then it's all. He might be gone by then, and then you're just the second best guy in the Bellator division instead of the first best guy in the Bellator division. You can't keep calling out Volkanovski forever. So there were big stakes on it, and this often happens. Sometimes rematches are absolute bangers because the two guys have been obsessing over each other since the first one. Sometimes they're not, because the two guys have been obsessing over each other since the first one. But this was paired with a light heavyweight title fight between Nemkov and Corey Anderson, and this one was actually kind of heartbreaking. If everyone went peak Bellator, the most Bellator thing that ever happened, so on and so forth, but Nemkov starts the first round all right. As the rounds progress, it's all Corey Anderson. He's taking him down at will. Nemkov's bringing his knees up in front of Corey's chest from the guard, and then taking one foot out and putting it under his armpit. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, because Ryan Hall does a lot of sole of the foot in the armpit type stuff, both in his own shell series he did through his own website and his new defensive guard series for BJJ fanatics. But it is something that he's always liked doing. And I was going, oh, that's interesting, because it's also the position that check her name again. Seika Izawa was doing against Hamasaki. You put your knees in front of the chest, and then you can pull your foot out and kick him in the face. But he was doing it. He's putting his foot out, putting it on Corey's armpit, like on the front of his pec. I'm going, oh, this is interesting. And then Corey just shrugged him past straight into side control. It happened twice. And I went, maybe there isn't anything there. But yeah, Corey's in complete control near the end of the third round. Throws an elbow. Nemkov slips. And Nemkov actually, there is, I mean, the Fedor's protege stuff is done to death, but there are shades of Fedor there. He used to love, when he was on the bottom, it was side-to-side head movement, and then at some point he'd reach under the legs and pull himself further through into the armbar attempt. And you saw Nemkov do that. He even attempted a good armbar with his head against the fence in, I think, like the second round of the first round. But he slips the elbow, but he slips so that his head ends up directly underneath Corey's, and they smash heads into each other. They both go, oh, that was a headbutt. And then a cut is opened, and Frank Trigg stops the fight to check the cut about 3 seconds before the end of the third round. And this has been the crazy part, because if they'd gone to the end of the third round and then checked the cut, apparently the technical decision would have come into play. They'd have gone on who was winning at that moment, and obviously Corey Anderson would have won. Which is made even more ludicrous when you consider that it was the final of a tournament and $1 million was on the line as prize money, in addition to whatever he's being paid show and win. But the important point is that Corey actually looked really good, and Nemkov is not, the clear-cut greatest light heavyweight in the world, because he was losing. And I tweeted afterwards that, I'm not saying Nemkov couldn't beat Jiri or Glover Teixeira. I'm just saying that there are no good fighters in the world at that weight. Some people got genuinely very angry about that. They're like, they're doing it professionally. I'm like, Priscilla Cachoeira does it professionally. Do you think she's a good fighter? But anyway, it sucks for Corey. They'll do the rematch. Probably he'll end up getting blown out in the rematch now, because that's how his luck is and how these things... Actually, on the subject of rematches, Pitbull's now 6-0 in rematches, which, regardless of how you look at it, that's clearly learning from your mistakes. It's like that thing that George St. Pierre used to say. He said, I can't promise I won't lose again, but I won't lose again the same way. And, respect to Pitbull. He never loses to the same person again, at least. Even though this was not, by any means, a clear-cut one. Oh, I forgot to mention that Spike Carlisle had a fight on the Rizin card. He, after a guy called Richard Biggies. And I was like, his nickname needs to be Dickies. But Spike Carlisle ended up getting ragdolled around by this Koji Takeda guy, who I believe is the new Miyata. Miyata used to be just a boring grappler, but he would suplex people from time to time. And Takeda tried to suplex Spike Carlisle twice, looked good, and then Spike Carlisle turns into him in the clinch, knees him in the groin, and as the guy's going, ow, my groin, it was square in the groin. It was pretty clearly deliberate. As soon as the guy's like bending over to cup his nads, Spike gets another knee into the body as the ref comes between them, and then the ref's going, take your time, and Spike Carlisle's shouting, he's getting a rest. What? But then the guy comes back in and Spike Carlisle hits him on the chin and manages to grab a guillotine and choke him unconscious. So it was a very Spike Carlisle fight. I called it the most Spike Carlisle fight, and someone said, did he deny the Holocaust immediately after it or something? What else was good? I mean, Aaron Pico looked fine on the Bellator card. Looked good. Always does. And then the UFC card, having had the Bellator card the night before, where they were like, oh, we can't go to the technical decision. 2 fights went to technical decision on the UFC card, which if you had been watching this for like the last 3 years, you wouldn't know that was a thing that could happen. What was the first one? Oh, Martin Buday beat Chris Barnett by technical decision because the fight was called early. And then Caio Borralho versus Gadzi Omagadziev. Was that a groin shot? I can't remember what stopped that. But that was fun, because Caio Borralho's like a karate sort of guy on the feet, but got taken down almost immediately, and then hit a giggler sweep into top position. So immediate boy status for him, even though I said last week I liked him. Miguel Baeza and Andre Fialho had a fun little scrap. Baeza definitely not as hot on him as I used to be, but Fialho, this was pretty cool because they traded right hands, and the difference was that Fialho followed up with a left hook and just caught behind the head, and then hammered in 3 or 4 standing collar tie uppercuts. And what do we say? If you're having trouble with someone who's slick, grab behind the head and start hitting them, because your footwork doesn't mean anything if the opponent's holding on to you. What else was interesting? Oh, Munir Lazez shouted out Daniel Kinahan, whatever his name is, the week that the DEA put out a $5 million bounty on disrupting his activities. As always with this stuff, really weird takes among the community where people are like, I genuinely saw this take, he only sells cocaine, it's not like he's murdering people. What? Oh, and then people get mad at Kareem Zidane. There was a hilarious hit thread on Kareem Zidane this week, who people hate for bringing up the fact that so many fighters are involved with Ramzan Kadyrov. Obviously, there's layers of complexity there, because if you live or have relatives living in his sphere of influence, you can't really speak out against him, because you're putting other people at risk. But when it's people like Frankie Edgar and Chris Weidman and Frank Mir going over there to take photos with him, you're like, didn't really need to do that, did you, lads? Especially as it was like a week before the UFC started doing like a Pride Month thing. This is about 3 or 4 years ago, but it was still pretty clear that Ramzan Kadyrov was committing atrocities against gay men. So that was fun. We've got the Irish mob in now. And then there was the main event, Belal Muhammad versus Vicente Luque. We joked about this last week. Vicente Luque's never had a boring fight, but the UFC matchmakers are trying, and they succeeded. This was not great fun. There is a Belal Muhammad defense force that you might have run into on Twitter, but I think I've spoken about him positively in the past. Like, there are elements of his style that I quite like. He's kind of like Michael Johnson in what I was saying a while ago. I wanted to do some kind of piece about Michael Johnson, and maybe even a series about fighters who have a few techniques that they use, but are able to slot them in to a changing overall strategy or tactical outlook on the fight. So Michael Johnson was only really straight punches and good low kicks, and yet he was able to apply those very differently. Like, he took them on the counter against Tony Ferguson. He went entirely on the lead and pressured against Edson Barboza. Fought a bit more on the counter again against Dustin Poirier. You know, very limited in the things he was good at. Had what the Warren Buffett circles of competence, but he managed to make every fight sort of flow into them, which is a real skill in itself. And I think that's what Belal Muhammad has been able to do very well. Like, you saw him very forward moving against Wonder Boy and against Diego Lima. And in this one, he was very much learning from what Michael Chiesa had done in his fight against Vicente Luque, and he was making him chase and turning him. And we talked about this in the pre-fight. I said Vicente Luque's biggest weakness is that he's got the turning circle of a barge and footwork to match. When guys sideskip around the cage, he tends to follow them and get popped with straight punches. And not only Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who is phenomenal at that, but Michael Chiesa, who isn't great at that, but took the plan, did it, and basically boxed up Luque, or Luque. People get mad if I say it wrong, and I like to say it both ways to get everyone mad. But that also set up his takedowns really nicely, because Vicente Luque stands quite high and square. When you get him turning as well, it makes it easier to run through him on those double legs. So if you saw those double legs, a lot of the time it was just bending at the waist, not knee to the floor, which is very common amongst good double leggers in MMA. They tend not to do the classical penetration step. They tend to just duck at the right time. But then his face would smush into Vicente Luque's chest. He'd get behind the knees and he'd just run through him. And because Vicente Luque's feet were close together and he was often turning and following, that worked really, really well. And he was landing good punches on the feet in his own right. Vicente Luque was doing some interesting stuff. He was switching to southpaw in trying to cut off the ring. We talked about his great left body kick, and he was trying to switch to southpaw to set up his left kick when Muhammad went to Luque's left. Problem is, like, what you need really to cut the ring well is something off both sides, and you don't want to be switching stances to set up one better than the other. So it was like he would switch to southpaw going, well, I know he's going to circle out to my left this time, when the entire point of Muhammad's game plan was to constantly switch between one side and the other. Landed a couple of good uppercuts to the body as Muhammad was ducking in, which we always like. But where this one really hit the skids was on the ground, because, this is where we're going to get into it. Is boringness a legitimate criticism? I've said it before, but I'm quite impressed when you get like a boxer who doesn't have any power, and they still manage to keep off guys who should know better and shouldn't be scared of anything they're doing, but are still getting outmaneuvered and outfought. I love a bit of Dominic Cruz. Dominic Cruz basically never finished anyone except Takeya Mezagaki, but still, I enjoy him. But with most fighters, people are a lot more forgiving if you are not a great finisher but working towards the finish. Someone like Gray Maynard. Gray Maynard was a really interesting one because he hit like a truck, but you wouldn't know it looking at his record because he just wasn't great at finishing people. He'd drop people and then run after them and couldn't tidy up afterwards. Or Jeremy Stevens even, he does miss an awful lot, but he does swing very hard trying to kill people. And there's the equivalent on the ground, guys who are looking for the submission constantly or landing punches all the time. There's a very big difference between what Khabib Nurmagomedov did on top and what Belal Muhammad was doing on top the other night. I put up a little clip on Twitter with no comment just to see how people reacted of him in the fourth round. He takes Luque down and he lays on top of him in closed guard with one underhook, basically punching next to his own head with one hand, body head, and not doing anything. Like, it's not even moving Luque's head when he hits him. And that's what a lot of this fight seemed like. It seemed like he was being busy on the ground, just enough to stop the referee from standing him up. And the real laugh out loud one was in, I think, round 4 or 5. Vicente Luque turns his back to start getting up, and Belal Muhammad wraps his hands around to get into a full rear naked choke grip. He's over the jaw, but you can finish people over the jaw. GSP finished Michael Bisping over the jaw. Danaher's squad have been finishing people over the jaw for years. It's not optimal, but getting your chin down inside the arm is like a time waster. It's a time buyer. It's not a defence. But Vicente Luque is sat there, and Belal Muhammad gets the full grip locked up, and then he refuses to squeeze it, and like Vicente Luque goes, oh, he's bluffing, and just stands up, and Belal Muhammad lets it go. It was literally like watching a guy versed in stage combat. He was like, I can really make it look like we're fighting, or like I'm trying to hurt you, but just at no point did he ever really want to hurt him. So that is why it was boring. And, that's my entire beef with a lot of women's MMA. People who just won't ever finish. People I know won't finish. So it's very hard to get invested in someone when you've never ever seen them finish. Or even try. He got a bit closer against Wonderboy, I seem to recall. But yeah, it just isn't super entertaining. So there are things about it that I really do like. Which I'm sure, the people who are getting angry at me on Twitter probably not going to listen to this podcast and realise, or listen to any of my old podcasts where I actually gave him praise when he was coming up on undercards. But it's completely valid to not like someone because they're not trying to finish a fight or because they're boring. But anyway, shocking fights last weekend. So we're going to do some questions today. I'll put up a question thread on Twitter. Let's hit that up and see how that's going. Gotcha Ghoul says, what fighters do you think every fighter should study? I think probably people like Frankie Edgar's a good one, just because he mixes his wrestling and his kickboxing so well. Jose Aldo, because defensively, very, very good. Very, very good fundamentally. And also, like, as much as we say good fundamentals, also very much takedown defense geared towards MMA. Hitting people with your hips, turning side on, grabbing the overhook, sliding them down the leg. Stuff that probably not as useful in wrestling shoes. All the limp legging stuff he does, but really useful in MMA. GSP, obviously, because just the issue of timing. GSP and Machida are probably your best ones for that. To just see it happen over and over and over again. How much of this game is just anticipation or setting an expectation and then changing it. I think grappling-wise, in the modern era, you got to be looking at certainly Khabib and all those guys who are making use of the wall wrestling so well now, but also Charles Oliveira, because he's such an outlier. He's so effective from the bottom, but doesn't chill out there, never chills out there. And then you've also got to look at some specialists like Shinya Aoki's and people like that, or Masakatsu Imanari. He was a gimmicky fighter back in the day. He had a couple of good wins, like one over Mike Brown just before Mike Brown became the best featherweight in the world. But for a lot of people, he was sort of a gimmicky leg locker, and he'll never really get to the top of the heap. And then the Danaher Death Squad, they had 4 guys they really looked at for leg locking technique as they were building their system. And Imanari was one of the top guys he was one of those 4 guys. And They turned it into an amazing run of leg lock wins in grappling competitions. So if someone has a weird gimmick that makes them difficult, definitely study that. You don't have to copy the rest of Masakatsu Imanari's game. You're not going to get striking like him by trying to learn his leg locks. Same with people like Shinya Aoki. Same with strikers. There's stuff to be learned from people like Curtis Millender, even though they fall over as soon as anyone touches their legs. Your job when studying that film and trying to develop is to ignore the part of their game that sucks. Bert says, as someone who's new to striking, what do you recommend one focus on that he will be given the advantage over other hobbyists or those who don't train? I.e., I often hear you discuss competent 1-2s and 2-1s. Well, there you go. 1-2s and 2-1s. I think understanding the context of what you're doing is really important. So for street fighting, 1-2s and dipping your head and entering clinches and things like that, really, really important. You don't need the combination punch in the street. You need 1-2, maybe a 1-2-3-2, something like that. Just go ham. But you don't need an awful lot of nuance to win street fights. An interesting thing to think about is understand the few tools that you can really make use of in certain contexts. So if you're in a kickboxing match with someone or a Muay Thai match with someone, you can do a lot more lead leg work than you would be able to do. Certainly a lot more teeping and then playing that into step up inside low kicks, step up high kicks. You can do a lot more of that than you would in MMA, where it's harder to establish the teep as a threat. Obviously Volkanovski has success with the inside low kick, but a lot of people don't, and a lot of people get taken down off trying them from just the wrong time. So that's a weapon that I would, if I was sparring with someone in a kickboxing context, that the inside low kick and the teep are things that I would love to get going against them. But the moment that you're sparring with an MMA fighter, maybe even only striking, think about what is most sensible to do in an MMA sort of context. But I think if you get good at straight hitting, maybe the teep, maybe the rear leg teep. There are tons of guys who have great success with that, particularly in MMA. Jiri has great success with it. Shane O'Malley. And combinations into right low kicks. The reason that people still teach it at every Dutch gym in the world, at every Thai gym in the world, is that it still works. If you really do hit someone's gloves hard, they will set their feet and you'll be able to dig in a decent low kick on the end. Propaganda Huey, Dewey and Louie says, why is it so hard for UFC's cameramen to show the fighters head to foot? Even Street Beef's YouTube channel does it better. Well, I've got a good relationship with Street Beefs. There's a couple of lads there who are fans of my stuff, so I like them. But honestly, Street Beefs, I've been really surprised by, because there are things like there's like a pavement fighting championship in the UK or something like that. Just idiot YouTube channels, people getting knocked out on concrete. But Street Beefs, it tends to be guys who are just not the best, but from legitimate gyms. So it's always a pleasant surprise. Cameramen does piss me off. Who was I thinking had really good camera work the other day? It might have been one. Rizin tend to do a pretty good job. I think the large ring makes it easier to get to catch the whole body in. But the UFC should be... generally they're all right. They're pretty good. They've got a good number of cameramen, which is really useful. But yeah, I'd like head to foot of fighters in shot at all times. But in boring fights, well, certainly in boring fights, but also in other fights, they do like to switch up the cameras just to make more happen on the broadcast than is actually happening in the cage. Do you remember when they got those really high def cameras for groundwork? And they were just for groundwork because it was like, this is when it gets boring. Get the really high def shit in so we can look at all the sweat and blood. But it is tricky. It's a tricky business. It's like reffing. It's a whole art form that even the best ones aren't entirely sure on yet. William says, Ryan Hall says that submissions are easiest in transition. He regularly rolls into submissions using momentum to start grappling exchanges. This weekend we saw Satoshi jump into a triangle choke. Who are other successful jumpers / pullers in MMA? P.S. Are leg locks still real? Leg locks are still real. We talk about this like every week. But jumpers and guard pullers, well, Ashikan Judan, Tobikan Judan, jumping technique, 10th Dan. Shinya Aoki, we already talked about him once. But yeah, he's done some amazing jumping attacks in MMA. I don't know if he's ever finished one, but he does get people into bad positions by jumping on them. We talked about his fights with Kikuchi, where he's just hanging off him. There's his second fight with Jay-Z, because Jay-Z was beating him up and then illegally elbowed him in their first fight, so it was a no contest. They booked the rematch because it was part of a tournament. Everyone expected Shinya Aoki to just get murked, and Aoki was all over him from bell to bell. Top, bottom, everything. And there's some jumping guard pulls in that are amazing. But jumping guard pulls are so... They're dangerous in training because you'll murk your training partner's knee. Every top gym bans them. They're dangerous in fights because I've seen so many dudes jump and fall on the back of their head. The most famous one I can remember is... Minoru Suzuki versus... Guy Mezger. He couldn't get Guy Mezger down, so he tried to jump guard on him out of the corner. Mezger just backed up, and Minoru Suzuki jumped. His feet clapped together in the air, and he was completely parallel to the floor, and then he just fell on the back of his head and couldn't get up. But I quite like, I don't know if she's ever pulled off a flying submission, but Jessica Penne does good stuff along the fence. She gets the overhook and the wrist control, and where guys like... the good guys wrestling off the fence nowadays are hitting whizzer throws. She's sneaking her leg all the way around into the opponent's hip pocket on the other side and jumping into triangles. And Gianfredo Pepe scored one in the UFC. I think that might have been over Andre Fili, which is a good name to catch in a flying triangle. Oh, and of course, Genki Sudo was the man in flying triangles. He actually finished a good number of them in MMA, and... there's a great highlight of him at the West Side Grappling Tournament or whatever it was. Just turned up and jumped triangles on about 5 different dudes. Go look up Genki Sudo grappling competition on YouTube. You will have so much fun. Pavka says, what if Rizin brought back the pro wrestling shoes a la King of Pancrase? God, everyone would get their feet messed up. That was the worst part about Pancrase. Heel hooks in boots. You aren't escaping. You're not going to heel slip in a rigid boot. Miro Grammar says, how would you fix Piotr Jan's issue when it comes to the first round? I think, he's a pressure fighter. He builds slowly. That's just always going to be what he does. Maybe I would try and get him to score some low kicks or something like that. That's what Greg Jackson used to do. They would plan their first and second round around a certain number of low kicks thrown or landed, because low kicks are just a useful way. People don't feel as threatened going for the low kick. And it's a good way to start getting, stuck in. German Suplex says, please ignore MMA completely for this episode. Talk about Elden Ring, cooking, anything. Elden Ring, mate. I've respect. I was playing this mage build that I stole from Iron Pineapple, where I was just shotgunning things. I got to, who's the gold dude near the Erd tree? Godfrey, one of them. And I was able to just I was farming souls by letting people summon me and then just murking this boss in one hit. And I always felt like I was ruining their playthrough of the game, especially if they were doing it the first time. But now I've switched to a strength build. I'm using, I switched from just the Giant Crusher to the Giant Crusher and some other big hammer. I'm currently trying to get those as high as I can, mainly because I had so much trouble with the fucking Fire Giant. I'm still not beating him, lads. Yeah, I think next time through probably some kind of Dex build, maybe Faith. I do like Faith. I started playing a Faith build and it was just going so slowly that I did this Iron Pineapple thing where you kill the giant dragon with a bleed weapon. New Game Plus. Ben says, what's your opinion on low output ground fighters like Bilal Muhammad? There we go, we're into it now. Most people seem against referees standing people up, but surely tapping the opponent's side isn't enough activity. Bilal has attempted 0.2 subs per fight in the UFC. That is actually shocking. Surely there's an issue there. This is the thing. The purity of the sport makes me say, if you get taken down, it's your job to get up. But then the end of the round lets people stand up. We didn't restart round 4 of Jan versus Aljamain with Aljamain already on his back. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it is entertainment. I don't know. I have no idea. I think there's some onus on Vicente Luque there because he didn't. There are ways to stop people from doing even just like the little pity patter things that Bilal was doing. It didn't help that Luque was just sort of laying there and letting him move his hands. So you do have to be able to sort of smother people, and then most refs will let you up. Yaya Mumbles says, let's hope this makes sense. How feasible is it to work a damaging clinch like the Matt Brown kind against a strong wrestler? Good question. It is an unknown for a lot of wrestlers, getting hit with good knees. I, I know everyone hates Leon Edwards, but I'm going to use Leon Edwards as the example because he does so well when he's clinched by guys like Gunnar Nelson, Donald Cerrone, people like that who want to take him down. He gets the overhook, he posts his head in front of theirs. That's basically killed their takedown attempts. And if they can't get their overhook free, you are free to knee them in the body. And the knees to the body are a lot cleaner and nicer than a lot of knees in Muay Thai, because in Muay Thai guys get their hips in as close to each other as possible because they're worried about getting thrown, but they're not like worried about getting bundled over and having the other guy on top of them for the rest of the fight. So they stand sort of square, feet square, and push their hips into each other. So all the knees are like those curving knees that are just sort of like mainly to look good and score. Whereas if you watch you watch the Leon Edwards versus Donald Cerrone fight, he just keeps getting his leg back behind him and hitting with full straight knees straight in the gut. I think the issue with the Matt Brown kind of game is that he was so forward moving that you're going to run onto reactive shots, which is the bane of everyone's life when fighting wrestlers. You want to put them on the back foot, but if you're trying to overwhelm them, you really do run the risk of running onto the shots like that. Getting them on the back foot and then waiting on the shot, and then applying that sort of Leon Edwards clamp on the arm, head post, hit the knees. Legitimate way to tire people out, I imagine. Knees to the body do absolutely suck. I mean, think of Overeem versus Brock Lesnar. Guinness Adora, the Explorer, says, is MMA still a young sport? Hasn't the plateau in development of rules, regulations, and broadcast product shown that it's settled in its ways, is as settled in its ways as any other sport? I think so. I think until the pay issue is sorted, because that's something that comes up. I mean, I bring it up a lot, and I'm probably one of the main people bring it up every week, but it's still coming up quite a lot. Until the pay issue is somewhat normalised, I think we are still very much a young sport. At the moment, it's basically week to week what the UFC is going, what can we get away with? How many of these fighters can we get down to 12 and 12? How many of these guys can we cut and then rehire through the Contender Series on a 12 and 12 contract? How long can we keep reaping in $300 million on this TV deal and giving it weaker and weaker fights every week? I think the thing about a real revenue split, like if we had a fighters union, a fighters guild, a fighters players association, whatever you want to call it, the thing about the revenue split is that the fighters would be getting a set amount of the revenue anyway. But I don't think there'd be this need to get one over on the fans every week. If you're not gonna try and spend as little as possible to earn as much as possible and make these profit margins as big as possible, if you're just a thriving sport where you're trying to make as much money as possible, but half of it goes to the fighters, I think there's a lot less pressure to try jammy shit like that. And I think the cards would improve as a result. So the moment that fighters actually realise that they're athletes and they are the show, things will get interesting. But right now it's still the Wild West, as far as I'm concerned. Zillennial says, Shavkat is a father now. We haven't really seen him against top opposition yet, but I'm very fond of him. What are his biggest weaknesses? Seems like he has a few of the bad habits that really tall guys pick up sometimes. I'd say his striking's been the thing that I've been least impressed by. There's sort of windmilling spaz out segments of his fights. He's not very good at using the height that he has over everyone in a striking context. I think it's kind of like the Khamzat stuff where he's got a few good things on the feet and he's a physical specimen. So people are like, oh my God, how are people... He's good everywhere. How are people going to deal with this? When in actuality, it's he's got a couple of good things that he goes to on the feet, but he goes to them so often. Obviously he's not in a boxing match, but if you put him in with an actual a quality pro, it would take him a couple of rounds to pick up on what he's doing, and then it would probably stop landing, and he'd start getting countered and hurt. But again, Shavkat is another one where there's not been a lot of him, so I haven't really seen a lot of him. But him being a father is very interesting because famously, Khamzat Chimaev, he can't fight as well against fathers. Once he knows you're a father, he gets soft. El Producto Jr. says, what video games will you be playing during next week's thrilling Lemos versus Andrade card? Literally what I was just talking about. How many of these fucking fight cards can we have? Just as many 20 and 20 guys as possible on. Because the money's guaranteed. The only way you're going to profit is by, like, shaving off as many of the expenses as possible. What video games? I started Death's Door on the Switch, but then I was like, oh, I might stream that or something, or do like a video of it, and then I didn't. I'm still setting that up. Sifu I haven't played in a while. I need to find something good. Oh, actually, I got back into Tekken again the other day, which is always fun. Michael says, why are good left hooks so rare in MMA despite their usefulness? Because I think it's because you have to spend time up almost chest to chest with people. It's not something you're going to learn when you're fighting at a big distance away from each other, worried about the takedown as much. Also, it's just mechanically a harder punch than a jab or a left or a right straight. Film recommendations. I watched Your Name the other night. I had a night in and I watched Your Name and I was like, what is this? I have no idea. And I fell in love with it. Absolutely brilliant. Kevin says, how do you feel about AJ McKee after he looked kind of limited against Pitbull this time? To me, it seems he very quickly ran out of answers and had no adaptation through the fight. I'll tell you what he looks like. He looks like a guy who's just been blowing through people in training and in fights without much resistance. And that'll happen. But then I'm not going to dump on that because Yair Rodriguez surprised me so much in his most recent one against Max Holloway. And there's a few other examples of guys I've just been like, well, that's flashy shit. It'll stop working, blah, blah, blah. But I think he's a legitimate talent who needed to realise that it's not just going to be a doddle from now on. And then accept that there's some issues in his game that he needs to really work on. Mainly his fucking hands. Alvin says, what are your thoughts on Zhang Weili versus Joanna Jacek for the Singapore card UFC 275? What adjustments should Miss Zhang make? Or should she just counter-strike like last time? I think the onus is on Joanna to make the adjustments. I mean, I thought Joanna fought really well the last time. It was kind of that weird period where Zhang Weili beat Andrade in like the first decisive fight of her UFC career, and people were like, I cannot see anyone ever beating her now. And then she had this really tough fight with Joanna, and in fairness, Joanna suffered a really bad swelling very early on, which helped perception of it. But it was a good close fight, and people were still like, oh, I can't imagine anyone beating Zhang Weili ever now. you go, what? I remember the betting line on that fucking Rose Namajunas Zhang Weili fight was unbelievable at the time, and I remember doing that thing where being like, I don't think anyone should write off a fighter of this caliber at any point, but who knows. Adjustments for Zhang in that fight. I think I'd like to see Zhang. I really liked her low kicks in the Rose fight. I really liked just the game plan she brought into that generally. I'd like to see her abuse the clinch a bit more, but Joanna's pretty good in the clinch. It's just that I feel like Zhang is so strong for the weight class, and if you're hanging around outside of touching range, you're not really making use of that. Now, there's someone who could operate a Matt Brown game in that weight class. I mean, there aren't many people who are going to be able to take her down anyway, with the exception of Esparza. Oh, third round Zabit says, what Faber versus Ricky Simone style matchup would you give Pitbull if he came over to the UFC? So someone to make him look good. Probably not one of the giant dudes. Hang on, we're talking featherweight, so probably not like Yair or Max or Zabit. I tell you what could be a banger, him versus Josh Emmett. Or maybe Burgos. If you could get him with Burgos, I think Burgos would continue to try and walk him down, and Pitbull would circle off and try and hit him with big single shot counters for 3 rounds, and eventually one of them would fall over. Tandaran says, best Tekken characters, Ganryu, Lydia. I play a little bit of Lei. Wei? What was his name? Fuck. I want to get good with the Panda and Kuma, but I've never put in the effort. I will never play a Mishima. I'm just not built like that. Don't like the easy way out, what can I say? Oh, I like Paul. Paul's fun. And Steve, actually, too. Right, I'm going to call it there for today. I'll answer some more of these on the next pod on the Boycast. Yeah, weird week coming up, but I think mainly on the Boycast I'm going to be talking about Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder, because that is a legitimate fight coming up this weekend, and I think there's a couple of other boxing matches too, but plenty going on, even though the UFC is phoning it in hard. And I think the Bellator guy, aren't they doing like Cyborg versus someone she's already beaten who I've still never heard of? But anyway, watch Rizin, that atomweight fight was good, and Satoshi is legit. I am your boy Jack Slack. If you want to get in on the Boycast, the Patreon stuff, the small article I might write about that atomweight fight I was raving about, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing at the time, fightprimer.com. I am your boy, Jack Slack. Remember the Lumax Cup, bless.